Podcasting is more than just talking. It's listening. BSing with Bob Schmidt.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast featuring people talking about entrepreneurship, marketing, and business. This week, taking kind of a different look, a different tone, if you will, since we're getting closer to Christmas. Wanted to talk to a guy that I met at the Publicity Summit in New York City a couple of weeks ago. Thought I'd invite Marty Vargas. A conversation with Marty this week talking about how he found his mother living on the streets of Philadelphia and how he kind of pulled her back into society. It's different than our normal podcast, but it's a message we're sharing as we approach Christmas. Marty, thanks for being on the podcast with me this week.
You know, it so happened that my life began a little bit different than most people. I was found in the streets as a little infant sleeping in the snow with my homeless mother. And I was discovered by an older couple in the morning as the old man went out to unshovel the snow, and he found me sleeping there with my mom. And eventually she gave me up several months later to that same couple. And I never knew my mom. I was shipped away, or I guess you could say adopted away, and my adoptive family went on to California, and I grew up in the Bay Area, and then eventually I lived in Napa Valley. And it was 22 years later, I returned to Philadelphia to find the heart of my roots, to find my mom.
How hard was it for you to know that you're given up by your mother, grow up with a different family, and then return to, you know, the quote, the scene of the crime, in order to see if your mom, first of all, is still alive, secondly, if she still remembers you?
Yeah, that was a very dramatic experience. Growing up without her was not dramatic to me because the family that I was adopted in was so loving and kind. They were the only ones I knew, you know, as mom and dad. But when I went to go find my mother, it was very dramatic because my brother, my older brother, my adoptive older brother, had come to visit us in California, and he had a massive heart attack and died. And so we had to ship his body to the East Coast. When we did so, it was then my cousin came up to me. Her name was Joanne. And she said, "Would you like to find your mom?" And I'm like, "Who is she?" And she said, "She's Rachel, and she lives in the streets." And that night I could hardly sleep, realizing the very woman that had brought me into this world was somewhere out there in the concrete jungle trying to survive. And so that began the journey, the emotional journey for me, because up to that time, until she asked that question, I never thought about actually finding her. And I didn't have that impetus. I didn't have that desire. None of that was ever coursed through my mind, hardly at all. But when she asked that, I was confronted with that reality. And so that's when we began our journey.
Did you ever think that your life up to that point was a lie, that you were living like living a lie, even though you may not have known it, but then to actually figure it out or to think about it after the fact?
Wow, that's a very amazing question that you just asked. You know, I had to struggle with being adopted. And, you know, I remember the day I was finally adopted and the paperwork went through. I was about 13 years of age. Mm-hmm. And I remember resenting being adopted, resenting not being original with my family. Kind of like, even though my mom and dad, they loved me as though I was their very own flesh and blood, and there was never that feeling like you're not. But you still have that feeling in some way because innuendos come from other directions. And I really resented that. But it wasn't until I discovered my mom and I had to process it. And then when I finally got her off the streets and processed it, I thought to myself, you know, I had resentment towards her too, because she gave me up, you know. And then it came to the point when I realized this was the very best thing because, you know, when I was working on my documentary that aired on television, I was filming out in 9th Street there in the Italian market, and most of the listeners would remember Rocky running down the Italian market as they're selling things in South Philadelphia. Well, it was there where my mother lived, and I was filming my documentary there, and a woman came up to me and she asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm, you know, making a documentary on a homeless woman that lived here." And she said, "Rachel?" And she called my mother's name out. I was like, wow. I said, "That's my mom." She said, "Yes, we used to find the dead bodies of her children in the streets."
Say that again? You used to find the dead bodies of her children?
Yeah, she would give birth in the street to children, and they would find their dead bodies. And And it just blew my mind. And it coincided with a newspaper article I did find about my mother, where it indicated she had given birth to a number of children, about 4 or 5 children in the streets, because my mother was in the streets for 30 plus years. 29 years. And when that reality hit me, then I realized I was so fortunate to not have been one of those children.
Right. Well, to have made it. I mean, to have made it. That's wow.
Yeah.
I mean,
thank God, that's a miracle.
No kidding. Talk about, getting that life-changing moment in your life. Was that one of the moments that you're like, this is why I'm here?
Yeah, it was life-changing. It would just made me appreciate every day of my life, and then I understood that it was for the best. And for me to be here is great. For me to have survived what I went through was greater, and then for me to understand how blessed I was in order to be here, and rather than curse the day I was born, to bless it. And so, that became a very interesting, experience. But that came many years later, after I was taking care of my mom, and because eventually I was able to get her off the streets, because she didn't want to come off the streets. When I first found her, it was, this romantic moment when I was searching through street after street. I'm looking for my mom. I was propelled, And matter of fact, I read newspaper articles written about my mother. And one of the things that struck me the most is that the newspaper reporter asked my mother, "Do you ever get lonely? Do you ever cry?" And granted, at this point of my mother's life, she's been raped multiple times. She's been beat in the streets. She has been, dogged. And she responded, "I cannot cry." And that's what gave me the impetus to say, I have to find her. I have to let her know that there's still somebody out there that really cares, And so we searched street after street throughout Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia. And eventually I came up to Broad and Federal, which was like, the main thoroughfare throughout the city of Philadelphia. And I knocked on this large cathedral, and only an empty echo came back. And then my cousin had this idea, let's go down to the shelter, because she, Joanne, had been calling every single shelter in town in order to find my mother. So word was getting around, Marty's looking for Rachel. And Rachel was not, I can't say popular, but she was not unknown, because she was sort of a fixture as a homeless person. And I remember standing before that large wooden door that was the last barrier between my dark and distant past. And I'm like, Joanne, we got to pray. You know what I'm saying? And then we knocked loudly, and in a few minutes, the door banged open, and this young black woman was standing there, and we asked for Rachel, and she recognized the name. She knew my mother, and she said, "Your mother is a beautiful person," that Philadelphia accent. And we were led down this long cement corridor to a gymnasium, and the gymnasium was totally black, and only a stage in the gymnasium was well lit. And I was led up, and this little lady right next to me was led up into this gymnasium stage, and Joanne took my hand and took my mother's hand and said, "Aunt Ray, this is your son, Marty. And Marty, this is your mother." And at that moment, that was like, wow, that just like blew my mind, and I got up, I hugged her, I gave her a kiss, I tried to make her feel comfortable, but she only responded to me with a silent, unbelieving gaze. And so that night, I just searched for hours trying to find, why did you ever become homeless, without asking her that question, of course.
Right. Yep.
And it was just such a moving experience. And the very next day, which was the most mind-blowing of all this experience, the very next day, I had to ask her a question. I said, "Mom, I want to know who my dad is." And she looked at me and she said, "How is Nan?" And I thought to myself, well, Nan is my brother, my adopted brother that I just buried. And I said, well, he died. That's why we came here. We buried him. And a tear started coming down her cheek, and then it all came to me. I realized what was happening here is that my adoptive brother was not my, only legal brother, but he was actually my biological father. And so the older couple that found me sleeping in the snow, that older couple were actually my real grandparents.
Did they know that?
Nope. They didn't know that until I was age 13, when that time I mentioned earlier that I resented being adopted and the paperwork came through.
Uh-huh.
It was through the investigation of my life and everything else and the paperwork and all that type of stuff. And then the story came out and they never told me.
But they knew as you're growing up. So your brother actually knew that he was your father, even though he was your brother.
Yeah. He was, my adoptive brother was my real biological father.
It sounds like that could be a country song in there. I mean, I'm not trying to make fun of it at all, but you know what I mean? It sounds unbelievable. Yeah, no, it was unbelievable. And my grandparents didn't know until I was 13 years old when the adoption went all the way through. But they never told me. So from age 13 to age 21, 22, this was a total secret, all my life. Wow.
And then what happened is I went back to California, but I couldn't rest. I couldn't rest until I tried to get my mother off the street. So I returned back to Philadelphia. Matter of fact, I took about 5 trips from California to Philadelphia in order to rescue my mom from off the streets.
Wow.
And it's when I went the second time, I saw her as she really was, smelling like desiccation, a wool coat wrapped around nearly her naked body. She was in deplorable condition. Her teeth were missing due to being beaten in the streets, and she was just a mess and a haggard, crazy, incoherent, homeless person. That's what she was.
Marty, did you resent Rachel at all?
Not for any of her condition. I never felt any resentment towards her. The only resentment I felt was years later when I was thinking, and for being human, I was thinking, why did you ever let me go? Didn't you love me to keep me? And that's when I realized it was better she didn't keep me, because I would have been dead. And it was during that time she spit in my face. She cursed me out. She wouldn't come off the streets. It was just unbelievable. I would go there. I would spend all my money, airfares and living out there and stay up with her all night, to protect her and come in the morning, give her food and wash her hands and her hair in the streets and everything. But she would never come back. It was one of the hardest experiences of my life every time I had to leave Philadelphia.
Right.
And then one time I decided I'm going to kidnap her.
Did she know who you were every time that you came back? Or did you have to reintroduce yourself?
No, she knew me. And she knew who I was. And, she knew I was her son. And my mother, the fascinating thing about it is that my mother, even though she was, forgive me for saying, but it's my mother, and I think I have the latitude to say it, she was a crazy homeless person, like you see in these big metropolitan cities, But I had this compassion for her. In the beginning, I didn't really feel deep love for her. And then one day, as I was contemplating, I said to myself, I have to just choose love her, because in spite of her, putrefactional condition, and when I chose to love her and I put my arms around her without that slight reservation, something began to happen. And I remember that night she was sitting on a box and we were talking, and the street sweeper started coming up and he was sweeping the street, and he looked at me and he looked at her and looked at me and looked at her and said, "What are you doing with a thing like that?" And I said, "It's my mom." And he was embarrassed, and he just kept sweeping on. And my mom began to really realize, sense, and I began to sense the love that I had for her. Before I was driven maybe out of purpose or duty, but then it became this thing where I was driven out of something I couldn't understand, and that's why I never gave up.
So did this teach you to overcome obstacles then, by having to overcome the fact that you knew that you were adopted, the fact that you found out that your brother was your father, and, did that help you to kind of set up your success in life later on?
Yes, definitely, because it gave me perseverance. And one thing I can credit my mother for having lived in 29 years total in the streets in South Philadelphia under the harshest weather conditions and the most dangerous times, is that I think I got my persistence and perseverance from her and also from God, because it caused me not to give up. And I really can see that, see things not the way they are, but how things can be. And that in itself, that vision, to also look at people, and I work with people, helping them give up their deep emotional problems. And I've done that for a number of years. Is when I look at a situation now, not in every case, because I'm not perfect, but it taught me to look at something and say, okay, this is a situation, but it can be better, or it can be different, or that person can overcome that. And the way it happened with me is I had to look at myself. And this whole thing, it broke me down. My mother, who rejected me constantly, broke me down. I had to re-examine myself and my own character, and it had to emotionally break me before I could be made. And from, I guess, my character being rebuilt, it helped me understand how other people can have healing in their life and how they can go from point A to point B, and they can become successful, because, people that are broken can be remade, but people who don't understand that they're broken oftentimes can't go beyond their pain.
Well, I think a lot of times it's like having somebody open up their eyes and actually see that, to know that they may have been broken. The book is called A Place for You. What made you write the book? How did you decide to put pen to paper to say, here's my story?
Yeah. What propelled me to write the book is the fact that I came to this realization one day, is just like, this is an unusual story. This is a really good story that gives people hope. And so I wanted to write the book not about homelessness, which is not really about homelessness. It's about my homeless mother and me and this dynamic between us. But it was about hope, overcoming difficulties, whether they're emotional, physical, financial, whatever. It is about overcoming that thing that is holding you back in your life. And that I wanted to inspire other people, because I realized, if I pass away and I die, I want to be able to leave this behind for others to be able to be inspired, in order to have the same type of hope that propelled me to go forward.
What inspires you, Marty?
Several things that inspire me. God, of course. He inspires me. Another thing that inspires me is I love to see where people have come from and to where they are right now. And we always lament the difficulties in our life. But I realize, there's a certain character in individuals in regards to persistence that causes them to go from where they are to, I guess, from their trials to their triumphs. And I hope one day that I could be that to somebody else, because I've seen so many people in that area that have inspired me, and I don't want to give up. I want to be able to make some type of positive impact in this world today.
What made you decide to become a media owner? Is it because you wanted a place to tell your story?
Well, I figured it wasn't so much to tell my story as much as to be able to have a platform to be able to communicate not only your story, but your principles, your beliefs, things that can help inspire other people. And so the story encapsulates that. But I realize you can have a lot of knowledge in life, but if you have no communication of what you know, or you can have some great experiences, but no one ever reads about it or hears about it or sees about it, then your experience is just in a bubble, And so for me, I like people like you and others. You've reached out, you use the medium of communication to touch other people's lives. And it does change people's lives, whether we realize it or not,
Now, when you look back at the whole thing, would you have done it again? If this was, today rather than when you did it when you were 21, would you do it again?
Wow. That's an incredible question. And I think I would, but if I knew what I would go through, I probably wouldn't. Because finally, after I got my mother off the streets, I got her to New York. She ran away, and she jumped out of my second-story window. She broke 8 bones. Yeah, she broke 8 bones in her body. It was a very dramatic experience, going through trying to get her off the streets, and then finally getting her off the streets, and then her going back into the streets. It was a 16-year journey, and that was the timeline. It was 16 years of dealing with these type of difficulties. There are times, in between those years that we were separated. And I remember the time where I went finally, she ended up in a nursing home, and I went there to see her, and she always was spurning me and rejecting me, et cetera, et cetera. And then one day I went there, and the little old ladies in the nursing home said, "Why do you treat your son like that?" What I'm saying? And I guess it caused her to think, and I sat down and I played the piano. They sort of commemorated me finding her. And then she said to me soon after that, she said, "I want to go home and live with you." And it blew my mind. And I thought to myself, and I said, I have to think about this one, And we made the decision, and she came home, and it was difficult. I'm talking about home for the last time. And it was difficult in the beginning, but finally she realized she was loved, and all her fears had melted away. And she felt included. She felt genuinely loved. And my mother changed. And that's the beautiful part about this whole story. She was no longer an incoherent, crazy, homeless person. She was a very intelligent, normal person. People who would meet her would never know that she lived 28 years in the streets. 28 years in the streets. They would never know. They would see her and, this is just a cute little old lady. And she would hold conversations and etc. It was finally she had a place for her. And that's why I wrote the book. It's called A Place for You. And finally she found her place. It wasn't in the streets. And I realized homelessness is not so much, not having a home as much as no one loves you enough to take you in. You know what I'm saying? Have
you given any thoughts about maybe jumping on the streets when you were, when you were looking for her, that you thought maybe you too could be homeless and hang with your mom that way?
Yeah, I became a little bit partless homeless with her because I would stay up with her all night and maybe go back and get 2 or 3 hours of sleep and come back with her. Homelessness is a scary idea if you think about it. And I think we all have had that at one time in our life, and at least I have.
Honestly, if you look at it, if you look at the, most of us we're a catastrophe away from being on the streets. A medical emergency, loss of a job, you name a few things, you have a couple of things fall into place, and it could be you. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, it could be you.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And most people don't realize that the rising face of homelessness is not some deranged drunk at the corner, but most people don't realize that the rising percentage of homelessness is mother with children. And you usually don't see them.
Honestly, I live in a small community. I live in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We have 52,000 people in our community. And there are a handful of students that go to school with my kids that are considered homeless because they either live in the car with their folks or they serve couches, And so the homeless population is out there, and it's in smaller communities, it's in large communities. It's an epidemic that's happening all around us. Marty Vargas is the author of the book. The book is called A Place for You. Marty, how do we find your book, and how do we find out more information about you and then the eventual outcome of Rachel?
Sure. It's Marty Vargas, MartyV as in victory, ARGAS. If they just go martyvargas.com, they'll find it.
What are 3 takeaways from the book that we could take?
And number 1, never give up. Number 2, though you see things as they are, they can change. Number 3, there's hope in the most hopeless situations. And I think those 3, and that with God, all things are possible. Just don't give up faith. Just keep persevering.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is brought to you by Orange Computer. Find them online at orangecomputerlax.com. And by Tri-State Sound and Light. Find them online at tristatesound.com. Tell your story with microcasts by podcastforhire.com. The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is a Podcast for Hire production.